Hi, this is Shashi Kiran, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar where we're going to talk about zero trust for branch and campus deployments. And during the course of this webinar, we'll also look at how do we bring data center class security from other places in the network to the local area. And the agenda that we're going to talk about today is really going to cover a few of these things, perhaps not sequentially, but I'm hoping the discussion will bring out a lot of these elements. First, talking about the role of the network in the AI era. Is it still relevant or is it redundant? And we talk about what does zero trust mean for the branch and campus deployment, where we see a lot of the users, devices, and things. There's been a lot of talk about lateral security in the data center, and now we're going to speak a bit about it in the context of LAN and microsegmentation. There was a very recent security threat that came about that everybody perked upon, which is air snitch. So we'll talk about what this means and also some of the use cases from zero trust as they apply to the LAN. And we also have an advisory CISO here who's come in to share some recommendations for people that want to go down the path of a zero trust journey. And then we'll have Q&A, hopefully towards the end or certainly during the course of this webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First off is Suresh Katukam. He's a co-founder and chief product officer at Nile. And while we look like we're flanking and providing security to the lovely lady in the middle, it's actually the other way around. I'd like to introduce Jennifer Minella, also known as JJ, who actually doesn't need any security because she provides security for organizations at large and guides them on how they can protect themselves. So, JJ is the founder of Viszen Security, also functions as an advisory CISO. She's a member of the IANS. She consults and advises everyone from mid to large enterprises to those in the Fortune category, and is the author of a bestseller book on wireless network and security architectures. So, welcome, JJ, and welcome, Suresh.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. So I know some of you might have questions as we go through this. We have people that will be answering them for you. Go ahead and type them in this chat window and submit them, and we'll try to get to as many of them in the course of the webinar, or we'll get back to you later as well. So, with that, let's get started. What is this particular webinar about? One of the key things that's popped up across organization is that for them, securing the local area network has become a battle, particularly in large campus environments, branch environments, across verticals. And it has emerged as a primary attack surface for them. And also, where they see almost two-thirds of successful breaches coming out due to a human element that is intervening. There's a lot of threat vectors that are coming in due to non-malicious configurations, errors that are also inadvertently getting introduced. And we see almost one in every three breaches coming in because you have this plethora of IoT, OT devices. Many of them are not built with security in mind. So this is sort of the state of the union in the land today. And with AI coming in, it's not just an enabler, but a huge disruptor as well. And that's changing the dynamics of the game. So for many organizations, this complexity that they see, where every user has several devices and a lot of things, it's become a pretty big attack surface, and the LAN becomes a breach magnet as a result. Now, one of the reasons for that is a lot of the architectures that we see in campus closets and on premises environments are really brought together over a period of time with a lot of point solutions that are stitched together. It's typical wiring closet in the campus may have a number of appliances from different vendors, or appliances from the same vendor, different appliances from the same vendor, they're all stacked up. And each of them have a different management construct, different cycles for patching it, upgrading them. License management is an issue, policy enforcement is an issue. and they don't have visibility end to end. Compliance becomes a challenge. So this is the spaghetti situation, and you compound that with many organizations that are going through funding cuts, lean IT, where the IT teams are really being stretched thin, asked to do more with less. And now we talked about AI as well as shadow AI that is coming up into these enterprises. It becomes a huge challenge. And then in that context, you cannot go about imagining that you'll secure the land by adding one more box or bringing one more protocol in and saying, I'm going to solve this and get nirvana. Securing this complexity in the land really needs a fundamental rethink. And so we talked about this attack surface, and it's not that these are happening for the first time. So if you looked at the data center and cloud, they went through the journey in there over the past couple of decades, where a lot of the disparate infrastructure pieces came together in a much more unified way. We went through convergence of network security, storage, virtualization came in. Cloud was a huge trigger to having resources be consumed as a pool. And then we started to shift away from perimeter to zero trust security and security across the stack, and then automation. Really where a few operators could manage hyperscale data centers. We saw a similar journey start to come about in the WAN over the last 10 years or so, where SD-WAN came about as a way to bring about simplicity across the different edge environments. Then you had ZTNA pop up, and then we saw the emergence of SASE, which was a convergence of network security. But now you look at the LAN, in the LAN, we still have that architecture and the spaghetti that I talked about in the previous slide, the Wild West, with point products, security being ad hoc, configuration being much more manual. And so the question here for us is, how do you bring that data center class security, simplicity, and speed into the LAN? And especially so in an environment that is exponentially growing and becoming complex. So, with this return to office mandates and a lot of the hybrid work environments, we see that every user, the thumb rule is that three devices, six things. And now we have this agentic bots coming in, shadow AI also coming in. It's just this attack surface is exponentially growing as a result. And so if you start to look at it in terms of saying, hey, what's this urgency? Why now? I talked about this return to office mandates where a lot of large employers are saying, hey, come back into work. The pandemic era is done. We want to collaborate better. We want to have greater efficiency. So infrastructure in the office environments and on premises becomes very important. Same goes for hybrid work, where you want to have employees be productive, whether they're remote or on campus at their workplaces. What also transpired is during the pandemic, a number of companies had employees working remote. And so they invested in terms of upgrades of infrastructure in the data center and cloud. But a lot of devices on campus were left unattended. They were deferred. So you do see a lot of unpatched devices. And then we talked about IoT, OT, which is again very insecure or unsecured. And you compound this with the fact that at the workflows you have lean IT and shadow IT. So I call this sort of the perfect storm arising from the three W's of workplace, workspace, and the workforce. And that actually has brought in a renewed sense of urgency in terms of why and how should you look at the land. So with that context in mind, I'd really like to now get JJ's perspective. She has a broad vantage points of engaging with organizations across different segments, sizes, and certainly who are at various stages of the security journey. And as we talk about the local area network, I want to begin by asking JJ, first of all, in this age of AI where everything is changing so fast and there's a layer of abstraction coming, is the network still relevant? Is it strategic? Then we talked about security, and zero trust is a top of mind concept, which has been there for a while, but now we're starting to put that lens onto the local network. How do we compare contrast to data center, and how do we look at data center class? And thirdly, with all this complexity in mind, we know security is an issue, but is it really so hard, and why? And let's talk about it in terms of what it means to the CI or CISO, who's really mandated with taming this beast of complexity and increasing organizational velocity. So, JJ, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Shashi, and it's good to see Suresh and you guys. So it was really interesting timing for us to have this conversation today because RSA's just happened, and there was my presentation is what Fortune 500s need to be thinking about in the next 5 years for network security, and it was just really interesting that messaging aligned with what you guys had come up with, just completely in parallel. And so the message really here is that the next 5 years are really going to make or break, especially the agility and the ability of these large organizations to meet these digital transformation objectives that they have. And I don't have all the slides from the RSA thing. You can kind of watch that online later, but the idea is if we kind of keep going through this is that we have all this technical debt and we keep optimizing yesterday's problems. So we keep just kind of building on top of things, but the foundation that we have for network security and infrastructure security traditionally is just really shaky. So it's this kind of like, you think about the house of cards falling down, or we're building all of these clunky bolt-on things on top of something that's not stable. And so, Shashi, if we keep going through into the slides, yeah, we're just kind of we're trying to fix stuff that we shouldn't be in this little carriage thing, right? We need to be in some Lamborghini or something at this point. So let's talk about like why. Let's keep the next slide and let's look at the idea of that life cycle management is not equal architecture. And one of my big soapbox items has been for years and years and years, we we industry, we security, we operational IT professionals have been uh, configuring products and not architecting solutions. And there's a fundamental difference in that, right? We look at what did we buy last year? What did we spend? Can we ask for some incremental increase on that? Oh, let's budget X% more for this Wi-Fi upgrade or for this edge or for this core upgrade or firewalls or whatever we're doing. And then we end up with some gap inevitably with whatever we were doing before or whatever shiny new thing we got. And so we start just adding additional tools in these little, like, okay, well, we've got this gap. Let's fix this problem. Let's buy that tool or something. The whole fear, uncertainty, and doubt in cybersecurity is something happens to a peer organization. Maybe it's ransomware. Maybe it's something like what we saw with Stryker recently, where an adversary came in. They were able to get into the Microsoft environment and basically just do a bulk wipe of everything using their management tools. So whatever happens is this when we haven't planned appropriately, we look at everything else going on and we just panic, and then we panic buy and we bolt on whatever additional thing we think makes us or our board feel warm and fuzzy at the moment. And that's just really not the right way to go. And so what happens is we have it's just a Frankenstein solution. And we can't move forward when we're spending hours. We have all of this great talent in our enterprises, right? You have fantastic people managing your IT, your cybersecurity, your edge infrastructure, your wireless, your firewall, all of it. And they can't do what they should be able to do because what they're doing is firefighting and solving these silly problems that are taking, hours and days and weeks of time. And if we just if we just think about like how long it takes to put together a bill of materials, I came out of 20 years doing infrastructure security and with an integrator Navarre, and the amount of time it took us just to get the right bill of materials for something that wasn't innovative. It was just this is what we have to do for this refresh cycle. So we can't do these new projects. We can't move forward with digital transformation. We can't move forward with zero trust. And I know the question is going to be, can we really do zero trust on the LAN? And the answer is yes, we can. So we're going to talk about how to do that. And if we move forward one more, we'll look at, the things that need to change. One of the other soapbox items I'm going to hit on very briefly has to do with what we do or don't do for identity on the network space. And when I say networking in this, I'm really talking about primarily on-prem, whether it's wired or wireless and all the packets moving, with the understanding that we're connected into hybrid infrastructures, and that's just the nature of life. But back to, does the network matter? Because that was your question, and I'm giving you a long answer to it. It does because we have all of these assets and these resources that were on-prem. Now they're spread across the globe. They're hosted in clouds, right? They're remote. We're remote. And the path from point A to point B matters more now than ever from a security perspective, from an availability and a latency perspective. How we get from point A to point B matters. And to do that effectively, there's kind of three things that we've been lacking on, especially the on-prem infrastructures. And that has to do with the identity, what we can do in terms of visibility and segmentation. And I think the segmentation is the big one. And to answer the question around sort of like what's different with the data center, I'm going to dive into that because those two bullets in your questions go together, which is, what does it look like on the land versus the data center? And then why is it so hard? Is it so hard on the land? And I think we've got, some great conversation to be had there. So let's talk about the identity and the visibility piece because we can't we can't do all of the cool stuff, right? If we want to talk about segmentation, in a few slides, you're going to see something related to, authorization, which is a segmentation construct, which is built on authentication, which is built on identity. So this is that foundation that the house of cards we've been working with. So let's move forward. And we're going to talk about the 50 shades of device identity. In the next two slides, we'll go ahead and get to really outlines what we've been doing. And I know for Suresh and Shashi, this is not new to you guys, but maybe to some of you listening. So I came out of network infrastructure for many years before I was doing the advisory work. And a lot of my early work when I was a hands-on engineer was network security and infrastructure security, and a lot of network access control, what's now turned into zero trust. And this is what we have to work with. So we're going to kind of go left to right here. And this has been the progression of the tool set for identifying what the things are on our network. And let me pause here for a second and let's talk about this. If it's a user-based device that we can throw a software agent on, that's easy, right? That's the easy button. You're done. Put the agent on it. Let it go. Server, laptop, phone, whatever. That's fine. But that's such a small subset of what's floating on our corporate networks that the challenging part is all of these other things that we can't put a software-based identity onto. So that's really what this is focused on is all of the other stuff, but this is where the exceptions are the rule because all of these weird things that are floating around that are headless devices, that are IoT type things, that are healthcare devices, manufacturing devices, even just stuff in our normal offices, like the collaboration devices, the smart screens, the screencasting, the voice over IP phones, right? All of these things, we can't necessarily put something software based on them that's ours to manage. So we start with things like MAC addresses. And as much as I hate this, the problem that we've had for so many years is this is all we had. The MAC address should be a unique identifier that lives within the infrastructure's network interface cards, right? And it should be unique. And it's what all of our network and security tooling has been using to identify a device forever. Not great. And sometimes that doesn't tell you anything about the device. It only tells you about who made the network interface. So then we got into profiling, where we said, okay, well, we'll take the MAC address. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe it's not. And then we'll kind of look at the device. We'll touch it, we'll feel it, we'll smell it, we'll taste it, we'll see what we think it is, right? So port scanning, looking at DHCP fingerprinting, maybe running a little like um, in-map scans against it or watching the traffic. That told us a little bit, but the problem is every time that you do this and you profile something, as soon as you do a software update on the something, your printer, your voice over IP phone, your screencasting device, your healthcare device, it looks and tastes different, right? It's like you seasoned it with something else. So it's a lot of care and maintenance. We get into the traffic analysis on top of that. So now we're saying, okay, well, let's take the profiling, but let's also look and see what these things are talking to. And that does give us a little bit more information, but it's still not telling us what the identity is. So then the last kind of progression we've gotten into is getting into like some of the security exposure and posture management on top of things that look like identity. But the problem here is you're not getting, you do get security context. You do get a lot more information about what the thing is and how it's behaving, and maybe the vulnerabilities attached to it that we didn't get in any of these other things. But Shashi, let's go on to the next slide because this kind of captures, and go ahead and click through, but this captures the headache of all of this. So what we end up with are most of the things I've talked about. We don't know from a MAC address what something really is. You can get into profiling, but I really like, this is melting snowflakes in my mind because your admin team that's managing a NAC product can't keep up with how often the endpoints are changing from a profiling perspective, right? Like you model it on a Tuesday, somebody does a software upgrade, they're not your endpoints. There's other people and other teams and other offices updating things, and then it looks different, so it doesn't profile the same. You're still in the traffic analysis, it's still a best guess because you're not doing traffic inspection probably. You can just see the source and destination. So a little bit better than just profiling, but not a lot more information. Mileage varies with that. When we get into the vulnerability and the exposure data, that's fantastic context from a cybersecurity perspective, but that does not integrate directly into anything that does segmentation, authorization, or any type of access control. So this has been the problem, and this has been my frustration as a person who had to implement these things for many years. Is it's just a lot of maintenance for very little return, and then everything that you did gets nullified hours, days, or weeks later, and you have to redo it. So this is that kind of working backwards of, if we talk about zero trust and we talk about microsegmentation on the LAN, we're talking about auth Z, so authorization. What can you get to, right? An endpoint, a device, a user, which is built on the authentication after you have proven your identity. But to do that, we have to have an actual identity for the device. So that's the soapbox. That's the little soapbox spiel related to why this has been so hard. Um, and we could kind of, we can kind of start to look at, like, now what you want to talk about, the data center aspect, why it's different,
Yeah.
how it's different.
Yeah.
All right. So this is JJ's like 10,000 foot view of, when we look at micro segmentation. And the thing is that I love, I love that we all want to do zero trust, but here's what happened. Because what happened was the data center and workload segmentation vendors came out with micro segmentation. That was their word. That was their phrase. And of course, everybody on the networking side, traditional on-prem networking, they went, well, micro segmentation sounds cool. We do that too. Except for we don't do that. We don't because we don't have an immutable identity to do that with. And there's a couple of other reasons. There's really two reasons. So when we look at what happens in a data center, this is, don't worry about the language and all the stuff here. The gist of this is we talk about an enforcement point. So the PEP, a PEP, is a policy enforcement point. What is controlling the access? When a policy says you are or are not allowed to get somewhere, or maybe specifies conditions, what is actually enforcing that? When we use software, the world is our oyster. We can do whatever we want to. We can use roles, we can use labels, we can use tags, we can use workload identities, and we can get really granular at the software layer with services, microservices, applications. And it's just really beautiful and it's really nice. And it's a pretty elegant solution. So the challenge here, though, is if we flip onto the next screen, what you're going to see is in a traditional LAN or wireless network on-prem, when we talk about something that we can't use with software, right? We can't put software on your random IoT stuff everywhere. So now what we're saying is the enforcement point is the network. Somehow it's the network. It's not software. And it could be a physical appliance, it could be a virtual appliance. But now we're talking about those identifiers that we were saying were lacking before, right? That whole rocky foundation that's not solid is we still don't have fantastic identities and identifiers. And our enforcement models now, we're back into, if you look kind of in the middle column where we're talking about VLANs and VXLAN and ACLs and VRFs, we're back into an enforcement mechanism that uses the network, which is typically going to be a layer two or a layer three construct. Sometimes we get further up the OSI stack with some cool application based stuff. Um, but this is the gist of why this is hard because we don't have the software enforcement. So I want to pause there and before we get into some of the modern segmentation approaches and just see if you guys have any questions or anything you want to interject before we get to the next section.
Yeah, JJ, I thought that was a really good summary. I know you did a lot of these sessions at RSA, and I liked how you kind of encapsulated what you covered in two or three of those sessions into just a few slides. But if I were to summarize what you've covered so far, it's really about the fact that if an organization is not evolving its network, then they could potentially see it becoming a liability for their business or digital transformation. And if they truly look at it, because clearly, as you're saying, it's a control point, then it can start to become an enabler or a force multiplier for that effort. And I think you contrasted the way we look at microsegmentation in the data center and in the LAN, and how do you look at the enforcement mechanisms here and the control granularity as well. Obviously, the concepts are same in terms of lateral security, but the enforcement and the mechanisms and the control are going to be different. So, good stuff so far, and let's keep going.
Okay, so we could just maybe cover a couple more things here. And so then the question, the next question is, okay, well, if everything, has been horrible from an option standpoint for the land, what have we been doing and where is the industry heading and what can we do? Um, So let's flip on to the modern microsegmentation approaches, and we can kind of look at starting with the not modern stuff, right? The things that we've been doing for 10, 15, 20 plus years is these traditional networking constructs, referencing the OSI stack here. So, VLANs at layer two, things like access control lists that are based on IP addresses at layer three, things like VRFs. So, all of the vendors have different abstracted constructs where we can kind of virtualize networking. On the wireless side, we have a few things we've been doing like peer isolation or client isolation. Within the WPA2 suite of security and Wi-Fi, we've had MPSK and PPSK, which is just the individual passphrases. But the problem with that is, that's a WPA2 technology. It does not work on WPA3, which is the security suite we should be using at this point. It's been out since 2018. We need to get off of the WPA2 stuff and we lose that type of segmentation and construct. And of course, the traditional network access control and using firewalls inside the network. So that's what we've been doing. The getting into kind of some of the newer stuff, I'd say in the past, 3, 4, 5 years. We have some vendors that are doing, I don't know if next gen virtualized NAC is the right phrase. That's a JJ made up thing here. But, we have some vendors that are coming in and saying, okay, we're doing network access control, but a little bit differently. Instead of using, SNMP traps and logging into the CLI as an operator, we're going to connect with API. And maybe we can even use the switch or the router's virtualization functions to do NAC-like enforcement. And that's cool. So if you keep clicking through that, you'll see like Elicity is one of those vendors. And that's interesting, but the NAC product can only enforce whatever the switch or the router has built into it. And so you're into basically an entire hardware refresh at this point, and then you still have to put a NAC product on top of it. In some cases, that's going to work for some people, but it's also there's not parity in a multi-vendor environment. So if you're not homogenous, if you have a little bit of Cisco or a little bit of Juniper, or a little bit of Arista, or a little bit of Aruba, HPE, whatever, you're not going to have consistent enforcement across those different infrastructures. So, but that's one of the options. If we keep going, we'll see two or three more things on the next slide. Okay, so the other thing that we had was the ZTNA vendors. So this is very confusing because we talk about how zero trust is not a product. However, zero trust network access is a solution set within the marketplace. But interestingly, it's really like more of a VPN replacement meant for, endpoints that we can put software on, connecting to resources. Those products were not designed to connect a user or a device to a network, despite the name. So it's a little bit confusing. But we took, so think of, ZTNA as like, the Z scalers of the world, where you have an agent that sits on an endpoint. And a lot of those vendors now are starting to realize the gap that they had and say, oh, okay, we need something that does connect a device to a network when we can't put an agent on it. So several of the vendors in that space are kind of adding some things to their portfolio to make that happen. That's another kind of mileage varies. It's still relatively new. The next little bit here in the middle square is purpose-built micro-segmentation gateways for a LAN. And there's a set of products in this space, a small set, but it may be growing. And they're kind of interesting because what they do is they basically, you point a network segment to them, and they do different things. Some of them will give out like a /30 address, and then that gateway acts as the default gateway for everything. There's nothing that's layer 2 adjacent because it was given a /30 address. So each endpoint can only talk to that gateway, and then the gateway makes decisions around what it can get to. Now, there's lots of questions that arise in terms of scalability, latency. Can you handle that volume of traffic going through a single point like that? And the products, also try to make it easier to visualize and categorize some of that traffic. But um, that's kind of what I would say is an emerging area that's not well adopted at this point. And I think there's more questions than answers in that model. And then the last piece here is what we're kind of working towards, which is can we get a per flow control at the LAN edge? And I'm using flow a little bit loosely here, but what I really mean is, can we take some type of an identity, like this user device or combination of it, maybe down to the application that it's accessing, and control that all the way from the LAN edge to wherever we need to control it for segmentation purposes. So some of the vendors in the space will do things like EVPN constructs, the stuff that we've been doing in the data center, and they're saying, "Hey, let's pull that down to the LAN edge." And they've been trying that for years. I mean, I applaud the effort. I think it was a good direction to go into, but the challenge is back to that whole without the identity. What are you tying the flow to? Because if you don't have control over all of the traffic path, right? If you don't have control over the whole path, you can't wrap your own identity around something if it gets handed off to you, which is how traditional networking works. Um, so most of the networking vendors are kind of going down this path, varying degrees with varying success. And I think, my understanding with what I've seen from you guys and why I think what you do is interesting is I kind of put you in this class with a little asterisk that, you're not having to rely on, EVPN or specific protocol constructs to do what you do. It's just built into the fabric of your solution. And I think that's probably a great place for me to toss the baton back over to you so you can, dig more into that.
Yeah, thank you, JJ. Before we get Suresh in, are some of these issues that you see in some verticals or some segments, or are these universal in your opinion?
I, I'm going to say they're pretty universal. And I say that having worked, for 20 plus years, 25 years,
Mhm.
in an integrator where we did everything from federal agencies. I mean, I even did quite a bit of stuff with, Department of Energy down to, financial, healthcare, higher ed, K-12, occasionally large churches or, so pretty uh, broad spectrum of the types of organizations. And it's the same questions come up, whether it's, a Fortune 5 company or it's, a mid-sized business down the street. These are the struggles. And the differences really are how much money and how many resources do they have to throw at it? But the problem is you still have to scale that because a larger organization that has, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users and devices still has to scale And we don't, because of where we are with AI, we what we're doing now is too messy to automate. We would
Mm.
just get messy faster with automation. And that's been the problem.
And in that context, do you see zero trust becoming top of mind as an architectural change from the ground up at all?
Yeah, it is. And, we talk about, especially in the IONS, training and consulting that I do with them, organizations tackle things differently. So there's not like a one path fits all. I think later, maybe, and if we have time, we can talk about what a roadmap looks like, step one, step two, step three, four, five. Um, but the 10,000-foot view of a zero trust strategy is an organization may come in and at the top, at the board level, right? They may say, okay, this is a good construct, like layered defense, right? Or defense in depth. So we need to figure out how to work this into each of our programs, departments, strategies, whatever. And it kind of comes from the top down. But at the end of the day, what happens is, even if it comes top down, the way we tackle zero trust operationally on the land versus the data center versus for identity versus applications, it all varies. Like the concept's the same, but how we operationalize that is extremely different. And so it is completely appropriate and normal for organizations to kind of find the low-hanging fruit of what can they tackle that's bite-sized for them. So maybe it's a VPN replacement. You know, there's so many options. Maybe it's dealing with, contractor access or third party or partner access. Um, so a lot of organizations will kind of, nibble at a zero trust architecture. Well, they'll, you know, what is 80/20? What can we do 20% of the work and get 80% of impact in whatever our biggest area of exposure is? So could be BYOD, could be remote access, could be contractor relationships. Um, but that doesn't preclude a top-down strategy.
Makes sense. And I think that's a good segue for us to invite Suresh in. So, Suresh, JJ did a wonderful job of establishing the strategic nature of the network, positioning it as a really a control plane for security at the edge. We talked about microsegmentation, how it differs in the data center versus LAN, and really the need for zero trust to now start to come in, especially as we look at the mess of being able to handle complexity, and layering security or AI on top of complexity is never a good business. So, with that, why don't we have you speak about what you have done and the team's done with Nile, starting off with the Zero Trust Foundation?
Thank you, Shashi, and JJ. Thank you, and it was great catching up with you at RSA. And thank you again for your time. And you always have great insights about current industry and the customer challenges and where they need to be going as we move forward. With that, Shashi, let's go to the next slide. So, JJ, you brought up several interesting points, and let's focus on two of them. One is lifecycle management is not equal to architecture. And then second is, as you walk through the security, you mentioned that, security is layered on multiple solutions, point products, and still complex. And that's exactly why we founded the company Nile. And when you think of, both, right, let's start with the network. You mentioned that network has to be the policy enforcement point, single point. We've seen that happening in the SASE world, where the SEC brought in networking and security together. We've seen in the data center world. But when you think of the campus and branch networks, the network and security are till even today two separate entities, whether separate appliances, separate management panes, separate operations, even today. And the reason, I'll go back a little bit into why did we get here is, as Shashi said, we frankly started with communicate first, secure later. We started networks that were really supposed to allow two boxes to communicate with each other. Then we started having the VLANs, private VLANs, and we started having the ACLs, firewalls, NAC appliances. Even today, in 2026, and JJ, we talk about, zonal-based firewalls. We talk about VLAN-based segmentation, even in 2026. And because we started with the communicate first and secure later. And we also know that, the networking industry does not need another networking company. And when you think of that one, this is where, you have to solve the two problems, the operational problems and the security problems. So when you think of the security, we need to flip the paradigm of communicate first and secure later to secure first, communicate later. And this is what we, Zero Trust Fabric, we'll talk more about it and as we go forward. But the idea is you need to secure the network, secure the communication, secure every user device and things that Shashi is talking about, and then allow them communicate later. Then second one is the operations. You talked about how lifecycle operations are not easy. And this is again, just like security is being bolted on, trying to solve that, bolting on AI on existing legacy infrastructure does not work. And this, MIT came out with a case study saying that, hey, 95% of the AI projects are failing because they don't have strong foundation. What does it mean? Strong foundation for the operations is you need to have the network itself, designed with a standardized architecture. You need to have a deterministic design. You need to have deep instrumentation. You need to have lots of sensors that not only monitor the network itself, but everything around the network in the environment, the cable twist, the fluctuations of voltage, power, as well as the RF, and even the network services, DNS, DHCP, radius, because when they do not work, the network does not work from the end user perspective. And on top of that, you have sensors that are monitoring network services and even applications that are running on the network. So you need to build a foundation so that you can build the AI where this data, deep instrumentation and sensor data is coming out in a unified model using modern technologies like gRPC, Google technologies like gRPC, OpenBuf and OpenConfig and protobuf technologies, bringing that to the cloud. And the AI in the cloud is constantly monitoring the data and fine-tuning the network constantly. And then third one is, like when you think of networking and security, there are lots of services, like to make it work. You need DHCP, you need GUST, you need, micro-segmentation, that trust service, and you need, radius. You also need the edge. So you need to build all these services where you don't really no longer monitor and manage these services. They should be like SaaS. They should be delivered through cloud. All of these services have to be delivered through cloud. If you go to the next slide, Shashi. So, JJ, now let's go into the specifically into the Zero Trust Fabric. So you mentioned about the users, devices, and things, but even before we do that, we have to protect the infrastructure itself, the network itself. And the reason is, as you know, when a particular device gets compromised, first thing is the device tries to discover the network topology, tries to get into the network. And you also know that there are so many the vulnerabilities we have seen in the network equipment itself, in the hardware, in the software itself. So first is you have to make sure that the infrastructure itself is hardened. And then second is part of your identity based that you're talking about is you need the full visibility. If you can't see it, you can't secure it. You need to have the full visibility into every user device that gets connected onto the network, especially the IoT things that we're talking about. So we deployed Nile to one of our customers, and there was a switch that was lying for years and years and several devices connected to it, and customer didn't even know it. So if you can't say it, you can't really protect it. So can you see all the devices that are on the network? Then, following that same thread, your authentication authorization. Next one is every user device has to be explicitly authenticated. There is an implicit trust. When you think of the VLAN and I connect to that Ethernet interface or Ethernet port, I'm implicitly trusted that, hey, is inside the network, so it's okay to be trusted. We cannot continue with that approach with the zero trust. You need every user device has to be explicitly authenticated. And just because I'm authenticated doesn't mean, JJ, I'm allowed to access anything and everything on the network. And zero trust tells you that, default deny. You need to start with the intention of denying, start with the default deny and allow what is specifically that the InfoSec team wants you to access. Right? So when you think of explicit authentication authorization, it starts with what we call segment of one. Because when you're on the network, when you think of micro segmentation, the lowest segmentation that you can go into is the segment of one. Every user and every device on the network has to be isolated from each other. They cannot see each other. So that's what we built into our solution, where when we talk about zero trust fabric, it's not just the network, but the network and security coming together and giving you by default the segment of one, and more importantly, least privilege access. Even we start with the default deny, but even after that, you want to isolate every user and device, and then you want to limit what they are allowed to access. So this is where micro segmentation, where your identity based policies, not based on the VLANs, not based on the IP addresses, not based on the ports that you connect to, but is truly based on identity. And this is where you want to connect with your Active Directory, you want to connect with your SCIM protocol using SCIM protocols, and not just the device fingerprinting, you need to go beyond the device fingerprinting, as you mentioned, to identify the device information, then applying the least privilege policies. So, we built in the micro-segmentation directly into the network. So now the network and security is a single entity, single pane of management, and single pane of operations. You don't have multiple entities, multiple management, multiple operations. Shashi, next slide. So again, summarizing, what we're talking about is JJ, you brought up this identity first, right? What's an identity? You brought up many different aspects. The user-based, there is, device-based, there are IoT-based, all right? And each one has a different identity. You have to start with the, where they get connected. You mentioned that there are different types of, different layered of solutions. So network has to be in the middle of it. Network knows that, but whereas security may not know the full identity. So you're handing over the security or the identity information to the security device. Instead, network is becoming the security enforcement point by knowing the entire identity. And JJ, we go beyond, when we talk about identity, we go beyond simple identity. We even look at, where are you connected? Is it wired, wireless, and location is also important in some cases where you get connected. And we use all of that information and you apply the policies. Now there's a micro segmentation, there's a fine granular control policies that, kind of two sides of the same coin, because once you segment, you also need to have the fine grain control policies. So in our policies, we give you the ability to define based off of the location, based on the time, based on many other factors, how you got connected to the network. And then, as we said, we eliminate complete lateral movement of malware because by default, we isolate everyone and we have default deny model. And it's built in, so there's no more, customers don't have to deal with the additional NAC appliances. You talked about, for IoT, hey, you need another, solution that is add-on solution, and you have to make sure that traffic gets routed to that add-on solution, the appliance that you have it. Right. So there's a lot of configuration, a lot of operations, a lot of management that you need to do it. Now, by building in, you don't have those. And more importantly, we talked about bringing unifying networking and security, but we also unify networking, security, but all the additional infrastructure services that you need in order to run the network. So whether it's a guest, whether it's trust or radius or DHCP, you need a single pane of management. That's where your lifecycle operations that you're referring to is exponentially growing because you have separate management, separate resources, separate expertise that you need. Next one.
Yeah. And, guys, it's funny because we have all of these. Well, it's not funny. It's actually quite sad. But, on the podcast, because I have a weekly podcast where we talk about everything at the intersection of networking and security called Packet Protector. And I would say once a month, Drew and I cover the news stories. And inevitably, it's some crazy breach that happened and you start picking through what happened. Now, one out of every, I don't know, 1,000 is like something super slick and advanced and somebody did something, nation state funded type thing. But the other 999 of them are just basic hygiene, right? Something wasn't patched, zero trust principle wasn't followed, somebody didn't have multi-factor somewhere. And I think it's a great point because the complexity, like we're already not doing basic stuff well. The federal government here in the U.S. has a mandate over the next 3 years to go find, all of the edge devices within their network infrastructures that are, not in security support, right? Not being patched any longer. And they've got 3 years to get all of that out of there. And that's the world that we're living in. So we're all caught up in these shiny little, things that we want to buy over here. But I love how you guys approach this because one of the strategies, like one of the few viable strategies we've had, is to start chunking up, right? Grouping different types of endpoints into different network layers so that we could say, okay, if it's a user-based device and it's something we can put an agent on, let's carve that out. Let's use a ZTNA product, put them wherever. It doesn't matter what network they're on because the software will protect that access, right? But if it's IoT devices now, and then we have to start subcategorizing the IoT devices depending on how they physically, right? How do they connect to the network? And then logically, how do they authenticate to the network? And we might have to have different types of networks, wired and wireless to support those things, and a different tool set out of those blocks I was showing earlier. Then we have a different tool set for each of those layers of things. And then by the time you get done with it, you're talking about 3, 4, 5 layers, not just different networks, but layers of types of networks with different types of controls. and different management and different monitoring and different security. And it's just frankly unmanageable. Like we can't do that. Nobody can scale that well.
So, JJ, you brought up two good points in that one. One is, you talked about 999 things are the basic set of problems. And the reason, we talked a lot of CIOs and CISOs on that front. And one of the biggest one is, like, hey, if you want, one of the first principles of zero trust is isolate every user device from each other. And how do you do that? And one customer, Fortune 500 customer was trying to do it. It took 2 man-years using private VLANs, which allows you to segment each one. It took about 2 man-years to do it. As soon as software upgrade happened, some change happened, it all, lost pretty much. And then second point you talked about is user-based devices versus things. I get it, when user-based devices, you can have a, agent, and you can talk to the SSC and be done with it. But I've been talking to lots of customers on that front. And many a time I found that CIOs and CISOs are telling that even when you're in the office, in a small sales office, that will work. But when I'm in a corporate headquarters, I need to access local resources. When I talk about, whether it's a screen sharing, printer services, and other services. So when you do that, that SSC model itself may not work. So you still have to protect users when they come onto the campus or the branch networks.
Yeah, don't even get me started on cloud routed architectures when you're on-prem. It's it's a whole different can of worms. We'll do that another day.
And so coming back to your point, right, why, we are not able to do the basic stuff because it's too complex. And this is the reason why Nile has built in the NAC or the security or the micro segmentation. All of these capabilities are built in. And more importantly, you get this out of the box. You don't need to really set up segment of one. You don't need to stop lateral movement of malware. You don't need to go and write explicit, rules for explicit authentication authorization. These are all built in. Otherwise, it's too complex to monitor and manage. Shashi, next one. So now going a little deeper into the capabilities, if you look at the current technologies that you brought up, right? Lack of visibility. Even if you assume so user devices have the visibility, but 80% of the devices don't have the visibility, and some cases you have the visibility on the wired or the wireless side, but not on the wired side. A lot of things are wired as well as wireless too, right? So first is lack of visibility. Let's talk about the challenges you brought up. Second is lateral propagation of malware. This is where you have the VLANs, you have the layer 2, you can see everything in it. And usually firewalls come in at the layer 3 boundary, not at the layer 2 boundary, right? Because of that, you can move across the network freely. And that's because once I'm on the network, there is an implicit trust. And I'll also go further, JJ. When you think of the building the so-called NAC solutions on the wired, it's almost impossible. I talked to many customers. It's operational reasons, not because of the technology. Because of operational reasons, it's almost impossible to enable your certificate-based authentication or enforcing the policies. And because there is an implicit trust that when you connect to Ethernet port, you are trusted.
Yeah. And I could echo that as somebody who did, successfully do NAC deployments for over 20 years, but it's not easy. And it's a 99% of the population out there says they tried it and then they had to roll back or undo it or downscope or, a lot of people have gotten fired over failed NAC implementations. And we were super focused on it. And, if you get the right product in the right environment and you have control over enough other things, you can make it work. That doesn't mean it's easy and it's pretty and it doesn't take, additional management. It does, but if you at least prepare for that, you have a fighting chance. But it is just still not an elegant, easy, or fun solution.
And on top of that, because of that complexity, they're going with the broad trust zones, right? And in fact, when I talked to some of the customers, they said, hey, I have 1 VLAN for the employees, 1 VLAN for guests, 1 VLAN for the IoT. And that's how they're doing the segmentation. That's how they're thinking of the security. So very broad trust zones and a lot of blind spots. And as you pointed out, right, lots of disjointed point product solutions that are available. Every time, when you talk to some security expert, hey, you bring up a problem, oh, there is a solution here. You bring up another problem, there's another solution. So you have lots of these different disjoint products and features that are available, but almost impossible to implement. This is where we introduced what we call Nile Trust Service. This is one is the one that brings out all of our security capabilities, where you can do micro-segmentation, identity-based micro-segmentation, and find granular policies, where right off the box, you get the complete visibility whether a device is connected via wired or wireless. User or a device or a thing, doesn't matter. You get the full visibility into it. Without explicit authentication authorization, you cannot get onto the network, right? And then other one is, as you kind of alluded, it's not just the authentication when you're getting on the network, in JJ. Even after that, there are insider threats, as well as there are, spoofing attacks, many other different ways of doing it. You need to do continuous authentication of the user or the device. This is where, UE-based solutions came up. Now, again, when you think of UE-based solutions, there's another set of products, another set of management solutions, and this needs to be built into the solution itself. So continuous authentication, continuous authorization, and when people talk about least privilege access, the privileges get accumulated over a period of time as the employee continues to stay longer and longer. How do you really reduce that? The access that is built over a period of time. Then more importantly, it's not just about protecting east-west within the campus and branch locations, but also the traffic that's going to the applications. So customers are leveraging SSC solutions. So you need to integrate your campus and branch solutions with SSC solutions. And this is where, the Gartner and some of the industry analysts call universal zero trust, where you're protecting east-west, not south, but every user type, employees, contractors, partners, all types of the devices, IT and IoT devices. You're protecting all of them, no matter where, and on-premise or off-premise. That's the concept of universal zero trust. So we have lots of integrations with most of the SSC providers, and in some cases we're able to share the identity with some of these SSC providers. So now we're able to make network is the proxy. Network is the security enforcement point. As I said, PEP, policy enforcement point. We brought in that security enforcement point into the network itself. Next one, Shashi. Okay. So, JJ, this comes up, hey, we have different solutions. There are lots of point product solutions, and what's the differentiation? So as we talked, right? First of all, security is built into the fabric, and it's not layered. This needs a fundamental rethink on how we do the underlying hardware and the software. Because as soon as you have human configuration, as 70% of the problems that happen because of the human configuration issues. And it's not, you can't blame the humans because it's extremely complex. And more importantly, everyone has their own way of building their networks. You have preferences for layer 2, layer 3, different protocols, different. So every customer network today is a snowflake. Every customer. With Nile, I was talking about autonomous network. How do you really truly realize autonomous networks? The only ways you need to have standardized architecture, deterministic design, deep instrumentation with the sensors coming in a unified data model and doing closed loop automation. So what it means is you cannot have snowflakes. Then a unified fabric across the networking, security, all types of users, all types of the devices, and then closed loop automation. It's not more about dashboards. There are more and more products coming along talking about more dashboards, more insights, but it's about time to realize the autonomous operations. It needs to close the loop and fix the issue, and if needed, call the human to fix it. Now, when you think of legacy box vendors, the market out there, they're product first. As you know very well, right? What we've done in the past was we built the technology, and we gave it to our technical marketing engineers. They build the best practices. They give the configuration documents, design documents. Then we throw it to the customers and the partners. That's what you're talking about. And it's your problem to deploy, monitor, and manage it. It's continue to be a product first approach. They're giving you more and more monitoring and management tools, but it's not really eliminating the problems, not solving the operational problems. So they do not have the service mind. And more importantly, as you said, every security tool has its own management system. Every networking tool has a different management system. So multiple kinds of management systems, and no one guarantees that your network is always up and running at every corner of a building. And you have the signal strength that you need in order to perform your job, and the capacity for all users, devices, and applications. So truly to do what we have done, every vendor has to redesign their architecture. They need to change the operating model, even how they engage, because when you move from the product to the service model, you're also changing the business model. When you change the business model, how you engage with your partners, how you build your internal systems, how you engage with the customer, everything has to be changed. So where I'm going with is, when you think of the world most secured network delivered as a service, it's not, you cannot retrofit it. It is, you have to go back to the drawing board and start from a clean slate and build a solution. Shashi, next one. So
Yeah.
now, so Gigi, you brought up as we were talking about 999 of the issues are basic. And, recently, when we were at RSA, we were talking about air snitch attack. And do you want to share a couple of things before I go into it?
I would say, you know, go for it unless you want me to explain it. Otherwise, I'll just add color commentary for you.
So in the interest of the time, probably we'll do it quick. So going back to your 999 things, why they go wrong is it's a basic. And so when you think of the air snitch attack, it's frankly, there's a cousin of similar, cousin of this attack. It's been published several years ago on the wired side. This is on the wireless side. Both of these attacks, they're trying to take the basic vulnerability in the network, which is the layer 2, where you're able to, MAC-based forwarding, MAC-based learning. And with that, they're able to spoof the identity extremely easily, whether the client MAC address or whether it's a gateway MAC address, and able to create man in the middle attacks. It's very simple. It does not take more than 10 minutes to do this, create the attack and show it. And, when they published, they showed it across all of the vendors. It's, the challenge. And it's not because of the vendor, not because of this. It's the underlying architecture, which is based on the layer 2. And as we talked, like Nile being a completely layer 3 architecture, and it's not based on MAC forwarding, MAC learning, it's based on IP routing, and it's completely isolate every user and device. This attack, by definition of, by design of the architecture, we eliminated this attack. This is a foundational shift that needs to happen. Is that, Shashi? Next one. So now let's talk about, what all the different use cases, we talked about while we were at RSA, there were several cases, right? One is customers even today is struggling because you have separate wired solution, wireless solution. There have been many times I've been at many networking vendors where for last 10 years, 15, 20 years, in fact, we've been trying to unify wired and wireless, different management systems, different solutions. And because of the complexity that you highlighted, the performance issues. And recently we were presented to some of our customers and they said, their performance issues. And we said, hey, we can eliminate 99% of the tickets. And some of our CEOs, they came out and said, you should change it to 100% of the tickets. Because when you do the network and the security foundationally and redesign it from an operations perspective, performance issues perspective, security perspective, you're able to eliminate all of that. And second one is NAC replacement. As I said, NAC is an overlay. It's extremely expensive, complex, and we are able to build it into our network itself. Then the breach containment, like as you and Shashi talked about, 60 to 70% of the attacks originate in the campus and branch networks, right? And it also related to IoT things. So when, this is where Nile can help, where you can minimize the blast radius to, 1. And recently, one of our customers reached out and they had one of their laptop got compromised and their Arctic Wolf and all their SOC centers are throwing out all alerts. And the customer was not flinched because they know that they deployed Nile network and they were not concerned about it. And they found that only that blast was limited to that single device. Then IoT and OT security, uh, uh, IoT and OT security. And then the last one is really to eliminate the operational complexity. As we talked, as you mentioned, the complexity is leading to 3x to 5x to 7x of the operational cost compared to the capex. And customers are looking for a predictable pricing, predictable expense on whether it's a hardware, software operations. They want a predictable expense on an annual basis. And with our NAS model, we're able to deliver that. With that, Shashi?
Yeah, thanks, Suresh. I think you both complemented each other quite well in terms of how you brought the narratives together. JJ, you talked about a lot of things, but for somebody who's really keen to go down the path of a zero trust journey, be good for you to walk them through what some of the best practices are, maybe taking a top down view for a CISO or a CIO.
Sure thing. Yeah, we can talk through the five-step roadmap. I love this. This is not I didn't come up with these five steps. It's just what's been floating in the industry since the NSTAC report at the federal agencies. And it's one of these beautiful things that just kind of applies really well to everything when you have a project like this in every environment. So on the LAN, which is the context we're talking about now, but also OT environments, virtualized environments, what applications, any services, microservices. So these five steps really quickly are pretty straightforward. We talk about the way it's worded in the document is do you define the protect surface, which really has to do with understanding what you have asset management and an inventory perspective. The second is mapping transaction flows, which is just a funky word for saying, understand how everything connects and what those flows are. Now that there's two parts to that on the infrastructure. So it's the back end. Suresh mentioned, you've got to have DNS, you've got to have DHCP, you've got to have all of the things that we're taught to check in networking that supports the actual client data flow. And then you have the client data flow, right? So what do specific endpoints, users, or devices need to be accessing, whether that's a resource or an application or a service set or a network, a whole network somewhere. So understanding what needs to connect where and for what reasons. Planning and then configuring the zero trust architectures. This is slightly modified language because theirs is confusing. But in step three, you are designing, you're architecting a solution. And when you do zero trust, you will need to architect. You're going to need to step back, look at everything with fresh eyes. This is one of the times I think it's extremely valuable to bring in a partner that's not making the assumptions, that doesn't have the same tribal knowledge that you and your team does, to come in and help you look at these things. But when you plan the architecture, you document it all out, you get it on paper. It's a fantastic opportunity, not just to design something cleanly, but also to work in the security aspect, because it's at this stage that you can figure out, and wherever you're implementing this program, you can figure out where you can put your security monitoring and or enforcement in place. That's a fantastic way to do that. Then when you get into step four, that's actually doing the hands-on keyboard configuration. And then, like any other project, zero trust is not an end state. It is a ongoing thing. So you will have care and feeding. And the fifth step really has to do with the monitoring and maintenance of the system, because as things change in the world, you will need to go back and revisit, possibly all the way back to step one, very likely, step two and step three pretty commonly as your needs change.
Well, JJ, there's a lot of condensed wisdom on this slide, and each of these sections are things that we can go do deep dive into in subsequent sessions for the audience. But I really want to thank you at this stage for the time that you've invested, the insights that you've shared, and how you've brought a set of very complex topics together in a distilled manner. And I hope this is useful for our audience as well. And Suresh, I want to thank you as well to bring in sort of the Nile perspective and build upon what JJ shared. One, there's an architectural shift happening. The network has a great potential to be a control point in enforcing security. We also talked about how complexity is an impediment for organizations to do some of the most basic elements, and that in turn leads to opening the door for security threats and vulnerabilities. Talked about zero trust, and then how do we look at a roadmap of bringing about zero trust in the LAN, contrasting with what we saw in the data center and other places. So a lot of distilled information with these two presenters, and I hope we will continue to have some of these conversations. The next one we're going to come and talk about is one of the use cases that Suresh mentioned, which is really about IoT, OT being one of the biggest security blind spots in the local networks, and they'll talk about how to fix it. So we'll join Trent and Chris from the Nile security team, and we'll go a bit deep into those topics. So you can register for the webinars that Nile is putting together, mainly to educate audiences who may not really look at the local area network as a security exposed area. So with that, thanking both of our speakers again. I want to thank the audience for joining in, and have a secure day and year ahead. Thank you.